When I first moved into Evergreen Hills, a seemingly peaceful and polished suburban neighborhood nestled just outside the city, I was simply looking for a quieter life. After decades working in the justice system, first as a prosecutor then as a judge, I had grown tired of the constant noise, both literal and metaphorical, that came with living downtown. The idea of wide sidewalks, clean front lawns, and friendly neighbors was more than appealing. It was downright therapeutic. I purchased a cozy yet elegant single-family home at the very edge of the community, just far enough from the HOA's jurisdiction to be exempt from its policies. Or so I thought. Within days of moving in, a woman named Carolyn McKinley, who insisted everyone call her President Karen, appeared on my porch with a clipboard in hand, a forced smile plastered across her overly Botoxed face. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped in a tone that tried to be warm but landed somewhere between aggressive and patronizing. She launched into a monologue about the homeowners association, rattling off rules, bylaws, landscaping codes, and even acceptable mailbox colors, before thrusting a contract toward me and requesting my signature. I politely declined, informing her that my property was technically outside of HOA boundaries and that I had no legal obligation to join. Her smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, claiming that everyone joins eventually, and that it's really just about maintaining harmony. I declined again. That was the beginning of my nightmare. At first it was small things. A warning note left on my windshield about the non-regulation color of my garage door. A petty complaint filed to the county about the height of my grass. A strange notice that my mailbox was in violation of community standards, even though mine was identical to my neighbor's. These were minor annoyances, and given my experience with petty power trips, I brushed them off. But things escalated quickly. One morning I found that my trash cans had been mysteriously rolled back into my garage, despite not having moved them myself. Another day I caught a man I didn't recognize taking photos of my backyard from behind my fence. When I confronted him, he claimed to be conducting routine HOA surveillance, even though he wouldn't tell me his name. I reported these incidents to the local authorities, but with no real harm done, there wasn't much they could do. Still, I began to realize this wasn't just overzealous HOA behavior. This was targeted harassment, an attempt to intimidate me into submission. Karen, was clearly not used to being told no, and I apparently had bruised her ego in a way she couldn't let go of. One day I received a hand-delivered letter with no return address, simply stating, "You can't live outside the rules forever. Sign the agreement or pay the price." It was signed only with a printed, "The HOA Board." I was stunned, not because I was afraid but because I couldn't believe the lengths this group was willing to go just to force me into their petty little power club. I knew the law better than they ever could. I had seen entire criminal enterprises crumble in my courtroom. But this was different, more personal. I wasn't dealing with gangsters or white-collar fraudsters. I was dealing with suburban tyrants drunk on authority, and they had chosen me as their enemy. Still, I refused to give them the satisfaction. I beefed up my home security system, installed cameras, and kept meticulous records of every odd event. I knew that eventually they would go too far. And when they did, I would be ready. I didn't need to flex my status as a judge, yet. I was hoping reason would prevail. But unfortunately, President Karen and her HOA cronies didn't believe in reason. They believed in control. And they were about to make a decision that would ruin their lives forever. It happened on a Sunday evening, ironically the same day I had finally decided to trim my hedges just to avoid giving the HOA any further ammunition. I remember the air being still, humid, with the smell of cut grass lingering as the sun dipped behind the rows of near-identical homes that lined Evergreen Hills. I had just settled into my reading chair with a legal thriller when my smoke detector suddenly screeched to life. At first I thought it was a malfunction, perhaps from the kitchen, though I hadn't cooked all day. But the sound was quickly followed by a thick, acrid smell, and then worse, a deep orange glow leaking through the base of my living room walls. Fire. Real fire. My instincts kicked in faster than panic. I rushed to grab my phone, wallet, and a hard drive containing years' worth of legal documents and personal photos. I barely had time to unlock the front door before the flames surged through the hallway behind me, licking at the ceiling, hungry and fast. By the time the fire department arrived, half the house was engulfed. My neighbors stood outside, some genuinely shocked, others simply watching with crossed arms and cold stares. One of them, I couldn't tell who, muttered, "Should have joined the HO." That was the moment I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, this fire wasn't an accident. The firefighters did their best, and while part of the house remained standing, it was essentially unlivable. Smoke damage blackened every room, the roof was caved in above the kitchen, and water damage had destroyed most of the furniture. I spent the night at a hotel, numb and unable to sleep, replaying everything that had happened in the past few weeks. The harassment, the warnings, the shadowy threats from the so-called board. This fire was their final escalation, their punishment for my refusal to conform. But unlike most of the people they had likely bullied into silence, they had picked the wrong target. I wasn't just a homeowner with a grudge. I was a sitting judge with a deep network of contacts, legal expertise, and an iron resolve. I called in a few favors that night: old friends from the district attorney's office, a former detective I had once helped clear in a misconduct case, and a forensic investigator who owed me a favor. If the HOA wanted war, I was prepared to fight on a battlefield they couldn't even see coming. The next morning, I returned to the ruins of my home with investigators in tow. The fire marshal had already ruled out natural causes. No gas leak, no faulty wiring, no lightning strike. Deliberate ignition, he said bluntly. The point of origin appeared to be my garage, which made sense. It was the only part of the house that hadn't been wired with indoor cameras. But what they didn't know was that I had installed a small motion sensor camera facing the driveway, more for packages than anything else. When we pulled the footage, there it was, grainy but clear. A figure in a hoodie, approaching just before midnight, carrying what looked like a gas can. The person moved quickly and with purpose, disappearing around the side of the house where the fire began. 37 minutes later, the smoke alarm sounded. We enhanced the footage as much as we could, and while the person's face wasn't fully visible, there was a glint of something familiar. A gold bracelet, thick and unmistakable, the kind I'd seen more than once on the wrist of Carol Ann McKinley during her smug porch visits. I didn't say a word. I simply passed the footage to my contact in the police department and let the system I had served for decades begin its slow, grinding process. While the investigation proceeded quietly behind the scenes, I pretended to retreat. I checked into a temporary rental and posted nothing on social media. I didn't respond to HOA correspondence, though they continued to arrive, insipid letters reminding me of my neglect to join the association. Their arrogance was astounding even after burning down my house. But that's how people like Karen operate. They don't think the law applies to them. They think fear will always win. They believe power is something you take by intimidation, not something you earn through justice. But I knew better. I knew that patience, strategy, and evidence were the true weapons of war in cases like these. And while they carried on with their smug charades, I built mine quietly, piece by piece. The emails, the forged HOA documents threatening non-members, the manipulated property maps suggesting my house was within their boundary, all gathered legally, all admissible. By the time the police issued their first arrest warrant, I already had the lawsuit drafted. Carol Ann McKinley, known in hushed whispers throughout Evergreen Hills as President Karen, had always struck me as someone who had never been told no without consequences. Her reign over the HOA wasn't about community or order, it was about control. She had built a mini-empire on fear, weaponizing petty rules and bureaucracy to dominate the lives of her neighbors. But for the first time she found herself on the receiving end of real power, not the false, clipboard and fines kind, but the kind backed by the criminal justice system. When the police knocked on her door with a warrant for questioning in relation to the fire, I can only imagine the look on her face. According to my contact inside the department, she tried to charm her way out of it, offering cookies and coffee to the officers, claiming this was all a huge misunderstanding. But the charm wore thin when she was shown the footage, particularly that glint of gold on the wrist, combined with anonymous HOA emails traced back to her IP address that suggested my removal as a non-compliant neighbor. She wasn't arrested that day, but she was rattled. And that was a good start. Because while criminal proceedings take time, I had no intention of waiting quietly while she tried to spin the narrative. I was going to take the battle into my courtroom, figuratively and then literally. With my legal team, I filed a civil lawsuit against the HOA and Carol Ann personally. The charges? Harassment, attempted coercion, trespassing, property damage, conspiracy, and emotional distress. I was thorough. Every note, every photo, every bit of audio and video surveillance went into that complaint. I included testimonies from a few brave neighbors who had also been pressured to join, who had suffered anonymous fines, or whose kids had mysteriously been denied access to the community pool after their parents questioned the board. The HOA, it turned out, had been operating more like a cartel than a community organization, extorting membership fees under threat of retaliatory action, falsifying property boundaries to bring in more homes under their jurisdiction, and leveraging silence through social pressure and shame. They had no idea what they were up against. Their lawyer, probably used to fighting over lawn lengths and noise complaints, now found himself staring down a seasoned judge with 2 decades of trial experience and zero tolerance for abuse of power. The irony was almost poetic. As expected, Carol Ann played the victim. She held an emergency HOA meeting where she tearfully announced that she was being slandered by a new resident with a vendetta. I wasn't invited, of course, but a neighbor secretly recorded the meeting and shared it with me. In the video, she paces in front of the crowd like a dictator defending her throne, claiming I was targeting her, just because she's a woman in power. Classic deflection. But her tone changed dramatically when she received the court summons. I heard through the grapevine that she tried to convince the board to pay for her legal defense using HOA funds, but several members, now fearing the lawsuit's financial fallout, began to turn on her. The once united front started to crumble. The treasurer resigned. 2 members quit entirely. One sent me a letter, anonymously, thanking me for finally standing up to the madness. The facade of the HOA's unity was collapsing and fast. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation continued to dig deeper. My forensic contact uncovered additional digital evidence, a chain of emails between Carol Ann and another board member, discussing how to deal with the judge quietly. One even joked about smoking her out if she didn't fall in line. It was thinly veiled, but when combined with everything else, it helped build a damning profile. And then came the big break, an insurance claim filed by the HOA just days after the fire, claiming damages to shared community property due to negligence by a non-member. The claim had been signed by Carol Ann herself, and included a falsified map showing my home as part of the HOA. It was an incredibly stupid move, a clear attempt to profit from the crime. I had my team send that evidence directly to the DA's office. That was the final nail. Weeks later, Carol Ann was arrested for insurance fraud and obstruction of justice. Her mugshot didn't feature the perfectly styled bob or the smug smile, just a bitter, weary woman finally facing the reality of her actions. Her supporters dwindled overnight. News spread fast, both locally and online, where the story of the HOA Karen versus the judge began to go viral. Journalists started reaching out. Talk shows wanted interviews. I declined all of them. This wasn't about fame. This was about setting a precedent, that people in power, no matter how small their fiefdom, must be held accountable when they cross the line. And Carol Ann had not just crossed it, she'd lit it on fire. By the time the preliminary hearings began, the courtroom was packed, both with lawyers, spectators, and curious neighbors who had come to witness the downfall of the suburban tyrant they had long feared but never dared to challenge. Carol Ann walked into court wearing a pale pink pantsuit and dark sunglasses, trying to give off the air of a composed community leader caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding. But the tremble in her step and the glances she cast toward the press gallery betrayed her. She was unraveling. Her attorney, a local real estate specialist who clearly wasn't prepared for a courtroom showdown of this magnitude, shuffled through papers while trying to maintain some semblance of confidence. Meanwhile, my team and I sat calmly, meticulously prepared. I had long stepped back from hearing active cases due to my pending retirement, but this wasn't business. This was personal. It wasn't just about my home being burned down. It was about the hundreds of people like me who get bullied, gaslit, and threatened by those hiding behind faux authority, exploiting loopholes and technicalities to enforce their own version of law and order. That day I was the plaintiff, but I carried with me the full weight of my judicial background, and Carol Ann knew it. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented the footage from my security camera, expert testimony on the nature of the fire, forensic analysis of the accelerant used, which conveniently matched a canister found in Carol Ann's garage, and the damning email thread about smoking me out. The digital trail was thorough, and even a jury of amateurs would have been able to connect the dots. But the most explosive moment came when one of her former board members, Douglas Matheson, the former HOA treasurer, took the stand. Under oath, he confirmed that Carol Ann had repeatedly pressured the board to take aggressive measures against me, stating openly in one meeting that the judge has to be broken or burned out. He admitted that while he didn't take the words literally at first, he became increasingly alarmed at the methods she began to suggest: property vandalism, fake citations, and yes, even symbolic arson. The term sounded absurd, almost theatrical, but Douglas swore it had been said more than once. That testimony was a thunderclap. You could feel the tension in the room shift. Carol Ann's carefully constructed persona, civic-minded, benevolent, misunderstood, crumbled in an instant. And for the first time she looked truly afraid. What followed were days of back-and-forth legal arguments. Her defense tried to claim that she had no direct involvement in the arson, suggesting the emails were sarcastic and taken out of context. They even attempted to suggest that I had orchestrated the fire myself for sympathy, an accusation that not only lacked any basis in evidence but nearly caused the judge presiding over the case to hold her lawyer in contempt. It was an act of desperation and everyone in the room knew it. My team countered each claim with clinical precision. We had the fire marshal's timeline, the insurance fraud attempt, the falsified boundary maps, and an HOA handbook draft that had included my address without authorization, something Carolyn claimed was an honest clerical error. The more she spoke, the worse it got. Her mask had slipped, and behind it was not a misunderstood community leader, but a petty dictator who thought she could bend reality to her will. It was now up to the court to decide just how much of that reality she would be held responsible for. Outside the courtroom, the neighborhood was undergoing its own transformation. With Carolyn out of power, the remaining HOA board members scrambled to save face. Emergency elections were held. A group of residents formed an independent oversight committee to audit the HOA's finances, and what they found was staggering: misused funds, inflated maintenance costs, and personal purchases disguised as community expenses. Carolyn had been using HOA money to pay for everything from spa treatments to first-class flights to Florida leadership retreats. The financial scandal further deepened public outrage and ensured that, even if she somehow escaped full criminal conviction, her reputation was irreparably destroyed. A class action lawsuit was launched by nearly a dozen households seeking damages for years of coercion and abuse. I was asked to join, but I politely declined. I had my own legal war and I wanted to keep it personal. The trial was scheduled to begin in full in 3 weeks, and while the outcome was already leaning heavily in my favor, I didn't let myself relax. People like Carolyn had a knack for slipping through cracks. She still had money, connections, and the ability to play the victim if she thought it would save her skin. But what she didn't have anymore was leverage. Her network was gone. Her lies had been exposed. And now she was facing someone who knew the law better than she ever would. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every person who'd ever been bullied by the very institutions meant to protect them. And I wasn't going to stop until justice wasn't just served, but scorched into the HOA's bylaws for good. The courtroom was silent as the trial began in earnest. The kind of silence you only hear when everyone in the room knows something monumental is about to unfold. Even the reporters who had flooded the gallery over the past week had stopped scribbling. Carolyn sat stiffly at the defense table, her eyes hollow, her lawyer whispering frantically in her ear. In contrast, I felt calm. Not because I was overconfident, but because I knew this court. I had sat on the bench for years watching the games, the tactics, the lies. Now I was on the other side of the aisle, but the game was the same. What mattered was evidence, truth, and poise. The judge, a colleague I'd known in passing during our respective careers, treated me with no special favor, which I appreciated. If I was going to win this, I wanted it to be clean. And I was going to win. The prosecution led with the forensic evidence. Traces of accelerant in Carolyn's garage matching the one used to start the fire, burn patterns consistent with a deliberate act, and the digital time stamps proving she was home during the time the incident occurred. Then came the damning testimony from the HOA treasurer, Douglas, who had turned state's witness in exchange for immunity. His testimony was more detailed this time, including dates, meeting records, and even voice memos he'd saved from HOA meetings where Carolyn ranted about setting an example of me. He confirmed that she had altered maps to include my property in HOA documents and had instructed him to approve petty fines to apply pressure. Her defense attempted to discredit him, pointing out his immunity deal and personal bias against her leadership. But the damage was done. You could see the doubt flickering in the jury's eyes, not about him but about her. The idea of her being just a little controlling neighbor had now evolved into something much darker, a calculated manipulator willing to use fear, force, and even fire to retain her petty kingdom. My turn came next. I took the stand calmly, even though I felt every pair of eyes in that room boring into me. I recounted the months of harassment, the illegal notices, the false fines, the forged documents, and ultimately, the night of the fire. I described waking up to the smoke, the escape, and the moment I realized this wasn't random. I emphasized how I had spent a career believing in the justice system, and now I was here not as a judge but as a victim. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. Truth delivered plainly is more powerful than any performance. I ended by looking directly at Carolyn and saying, "You came to my house not to welcome me but to warn me. You thought your title made you untouchable. But where I come from, no one is above the law. not even self-declared queens of a cul-de-sac. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Carol-Ann's defense tried to mount a counterattack. They brought in a character witness, her friend from a neighboring HOA, who painted her as a devoted civic leader with strong but fair values. They showed photos of her organizing block parties, painting murals, planting community gardens. But it was too little too late. The jury had seen the other side, the emails, the threats, the tampered documents, the timeline that showed her near my property just before the fire. The prosecutors rested their case, and the judge sent the jury into deliberation. It didn't take long. Just under 5 hours later they returned. Guilty, the foreman said clearly on all counts: insurance fraud, harassment, property damage, attempted coercion, and criminal conspiracy. Carol-Ann's knees buckled. She grabbed the table, whispering to her lawyer in frantic disbelief. "They can't do this. I am the HOA. I run everything," she muttered, audibly enough that a nearby court reporter caught it and almost smiled. The judge, ever the professional, remained neutral. He listed out the sentencing guidelines and informed her that her bail was revoked pending sentencing due to the severity of the crimes and flight risk. The bailiff escorted her out of the room, and just like that, the mighty Karen of Evergreen Hills was no longer a president, just a convicted felon awaiting sentencing. Outside the courthouse, news cameras captured the moment. Reporters rushed to interview me, but I declined again. Instead, I walked through the crowd quietly, past my neighbors, past the reporters, past the flashbulbs. Justice didn't need a soundbite. It had just spoken for itself. And yet this wasn't over. Because while Carol-Ann was finally behind bars, the system that enabled her, the flawed, unchecked power of HOAs operating without oversight, was still out there. And I had a plan for that too. With the verdict delivered and Carol-Ann awaiting sentencing, most people assumed the story would quietly fade into the background. But for me it was only the end of one chapter. What Carol-Ann had done wasn't just criminal, it was symptomatic of something much bigger. In the aftermath of the trial, I was inundated with emails, letters, and phone calls from across the country. Former HOA members, homeowners, even real estate lawyers, all with their own horror stories. People had been fined thousands for unauthorized plants in their gardens, denied home repairs, blocked from selling their houses because of disputes over lawn decorations. A retired couple in Arizona reached out. They were sued by their HOA for painting their garage the same color it had been for 20 years. A single mother in Georgia had been harassed into foreclosure over unpaid dues that had been wrongly applied to her. The stories kept coming. What began as a personal battle had clearly touched a nerve across the country. Homeowners associations, originally meant to preserve order and property values, had in too many cases evolved into miniature tyrannies, often led by people like Carol-Ann, power-hungry, unaccountable, and fueled by ego more than any real sense of duty. It was then that I realized the verdict in my case couldn't be the final word. I had a rare platform, and more importantly, I had credibility in both the legal and legislative worlds. So I began drafting a proposal. Not a scorched earth campaign to abolish HOAs, there are plenty that function well, managed by reasonable people, but a framework to regulate them more effectively. I titled it the Homeowner Fairness and Accountability Act, a proposed piece of legislation aimed at reining in rogue HOA boards. It called for mandatory transparency in HOA elections, state audits of HOA finances every 2 years, whistleblower protections for board members who report abuse, and clear legal boundaries that prevent HOAs from expanding their authority through manipulated documents or unvoted amendments. Most importantly, it included a clause requiring third-party mediation before any punitive action could be taken against a homeowner. No more unchecked power. No more anonymous threats. And definitely no more symbolic arson. I scheduled a meeting with my state senator, an old acquaintance who had followed my trial with great interest. To his credit, he didn't hesitate. He saw what I saw, that this was more than a local dispute, it was a civil rights issue masquerading as community governance. We worked together over the following weeks, tightening the language, preparing for pushback. And there was pushback. HOA lobbyists and real estate interests bristled at the idea of regulation. Some called it overreach. Others accused me of launching a vendetta because of what happened to my house. I let them bark. Meanwhile, homeowner advocacy groups rallied behind the proposal. A petition supporting the bill gathered over 100,000 signatures in a matter of weeks. News outlets picked up the story again, this time framing it as a grassroots revolution against corrupt HOA practices. Back in Evergreen Hills, the neighborhood was undergoing a transformation of its own. With Carol-Ann gone and the rest of the board either resigned or ousted, the new HOA leadership, led by a soft-spoken retired teacher named Marla, opted for transparency, kindness, and community building over control. The new bylaws were written in plain English. The first board meeting was held publicly, outside on the lawn, with folding chairs and lemonade. Neighbors who once avoided each other now mingled freely. Kids played without fear of unsanctioned chalk drawings, leading to fines. The home I once saw as a battleground slowly became, once again, a sanctuary. I was still living in a rental, waiting for the reconstruction of my house to be completed. Insurance had finally come through, and I'd decided not to rebuild exactly what I'd lost, but something stronger, smarter, more secure. Every brick would stand as a reminder, not just of what I'd survived but of what I'd changed. One afternoon as I drove by the construction site, I saw something unexpected. A small group of neighbors planting flowers around the edge of my property. No HOA orders, no fines, no agenda. Just kindness. Voluntary human kindness. I stepped out of the car and thanked them. One of the women, a mother of two, smiled and said, "This neighborhood is finally ours again. Thanks to you." The gratitude was nice, but I hadn't done it for thanks. I had done it because the law should protect people, not punish them. Because no one should live in fear of their neighbors. Because silence only empowers tyrants, whether they wear robes, suits, or pastel cardigans with "President" embroidered on the chest. And as I stood there watching my new home rise from the ashes, I knew one thing for certain. Evergreen Hills would never be the same. And neither would I. Months passed, and with each one, the world grew quieter, but not in the way it had been when I first moved to Evergreen Hills seeking peace. No, this quiet was different. It was earned. It was the hush that follows a storm, the silence that comes not from fear, but from resolution. The kind that settles in when justice has finally been served. My home was finished by early spring. It wasn't just a reconstruction of what had been destroyed, it was a deliberate statement. Reinforced foundation. Fire-resistant materials. Advanced surveillance built discreetly into the architecture. A symbolic fortress, not against neighbors but against tyranny disguised as community. People came by to visit. Some brought wine, others brought cookies, and a few just came to say thank you, still unsure how to put into words what they felt. I understood. What I had done wasn't just a personal victory. It was a cultural shift. I didn't just burn down a bad system. I exposed it for the nation to see. The Homeowner Fairness and Accountability Act passed with bipartisan support. The legislature, weary of years of complaints and emboldened by the attention my trial had received, pushed it through with little resistance in the end. Even the opposition realized fighting against protections for everyday homeowners made for bad optics. News stations ran with headlines like "HOA Power Curbed After Judge Wins Battle Against Rogue Board," and "The Rise and Fall of the Queen of Control." The bill was signed into law in a modest ceremony, and though I was offered a spotlight seat, I politely declined. I didn't need to be center stage. Justice wasn't about attention. It was about change. Real, tangible, legislative change. And we had achieved that. I stood at the back, hands clasped, watching history move forward, and in a quiet moment felt something close to peace. But peace didn't mean forgetting. Carol Ann was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 8. The judge, fair, restrained, but firm, noted her complete lack of remorse, her repeated attempts to manipulate the court, and her abuse of trust within a public leadership role. Her lawyer requested leniency based on her emotional instability during the HOA's decline. The court wasn't moved. No amount of fragile pride or crocodile tears could erase the fact that she had orchestrated a literal campaign of fear, culminating in arson, fraud, and years of psychological torment. She was led out of the courtroom in cuffs. No pastel cardigan, no clipboard, no power. Just a number in the state's correctional system. And just like that, the woman who once ruled over Evergreen Hills with an iron smile became a cautionary tale taught in law schools and HOA training seminars across the country. I received letters from law students, from paralegals, from community advocates. One law professor even asked if I'd be willing to speak at a symposium about property rights and suburban governance. I agreed, eventually, but only after requesting that the focus not be on me, but on what happens when unchecked power festers in the absence of accountability. The real story, I told them, wasn't about a house on fire. It was about a neighborhood that had forgotten how to say no. About systems that let small people become monsters simply because no one wanted to make noise. And perhaps most importantly, about how easily fear takes root in places that are supposed to be safe. Evergreen Hills was never supposed to be a battleground. But silence gave it barbed wire. Still, there were bright spots, many of them. The HOA that replaced Carolan's regime began implementing democratic principles. Real voting. Open meetings. Independent budgeting. Rules had to be reviewed by a third party before being adopted. And most crucially, membership was now 100% voluntary. I never joined, but I was invited. Not coerced. Not fined. Just invited. And I appreciated that. It was proof that the pendulum had swung back to reason. As the anniversary of the fire approached, I stood one evening on my new porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun dip below the rooftops. The sky was streaked with orange and violet, the same hues that had once lit up in flames behind my walls. But now they carried a different meaning, not destruction but closure. A child rode past on a bike, waved and shouted, "Hey Judge." I waved back. Another neighbor walked her dog and smiled, no longer avoiding eye contact. The atmosphere had changed. We weren't just residents anymore. We were a community. I sometimes think about how close I came to losing everything, and how that loss, in a strange and painful way, gave me back my purpose. Retirement had left me idle. But this gave me one last verdict to deliver. Not from the bench but from life itself. And it reminded me that justice doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it wears work boots, carries court filings, and walks out of burning homes with its head held high.